My sister-in-law screamed at me for taking a teenager to Disneyland, not a stranger's kid. My cousin's daughter, Stacy, 16 years old, one weekend, her idea of fun. I bought the tickets, drove the whole way, and brought her home safe Sunday night. By most people's definition, that's a normal thing an uncle does. My sister-in-law didn't see it that way. Because 3 weeks earlier, I had told my brother Mark I wouldn't spend 10 days alone caring for his son Connor while they flew to Europe for what he called their second honeymoon. Connor is 16, autistic, nonverbal, and extremely sensitive to noise and crowds. When he gets overstimulated, the meltdowns can last hours. I learned that the hard way during a family dinner at a Korean BBQ place 2 years ago, 6 hours into a situation I was completely unqualified to handle. The list of people Connor actually trusts during a meltdown is short. His dad, his mom, my sister-in-law, and his grandparents. I'm not on that list. But when someone mentioned Disneyland in the family group chat, my sister-in-law did the math. If I could take Stacy for a weekend, then I was choosing not to help Connor. That was her argument. Here's mine. Connor is not my child, and pretending I can replace the people trained to care for him isn't kindness. It's irresponsible. But that sentence, those boundaries, turned one family dinner into a screaming match. And it ended with me changing my phone number, moving apartments, and planning to leave the country. All because I said no to a 10-day babysitting request. Here's what actually happened. Let me give you the full picture before I get to the kitchen. I'm 31. I live alone in an apartment in the LA area, about 90 minutes from Mark's house. I work a normal schedule, can to keep mostly to myself, and I have a cat. A detail that ends up mattering more than people expect, because Connor is severely allergic, not mildly sensitive. Allergic enough that bringing Connor to my place was never realistic. Boarding my cat for days at a time was also an expense and disruption, nobody suggesting I help more ever included in their calculations. Mark is 40. He and Connor's bio mom divorced when Connor was young. Mark remarried about 2.5 years ago. That's when Sil came into the picture. Connor primarily lives with Mark and Sil, with regular time at his bio mom's place and visits with our parents. That system works because the people in it actually know Connor. They know his triggers, his sensory limits, what calms him down when he gets overstimulated, and what makes things worse. That kind of knowledge takes years to build, and it lives in the people who have been doing the work. I learned that the hard way. 2 years ago, before Sael joined the family, I tried to handle Connor alone for an afternoon. It lasted about 6 hours. By the end of it, Connor was in a full meltdown, and I was standing in the hallway, realizing I had absolutely no idea how to help him. After that day, I sat down with Mark and set a clear boundary. I told him directly, I love Connor, I will always show up for birthdays, holidays, and family events, but I cannot be a solo caregiver. Not because I don't care, because I tried, and the result was genuinely bad for both of us. Connor deserved someone who actually knew how to help him. Mark said he understood. My parents were there for that conversation. My sister was there too. Everyone agreed the boundary was reasonable. That agreement existed long before Sil arrived. Sil grew up in a very different kind of family. Large extended family in the Midwest. Cousins helping cousins, aunts doing pickups. If someone needed childcare, the expectation wasn't that you'd ask. It was that the family would simply show up. She also spent a lot of time in online communities centered around raising children with high support needs, communities where people talked constantly about the village. The idea that raising a child takes a whole network. And in that framework, anyone who refuses a role in that network isn't setting boundaries. They're abandoning the village. I understood the idea, but ideas don't cancel a cat allergy. They don't erase a 90-minute drive. And they definitely don't give someone skills they've already proven they don't have. Understanding a philosophy and actually being capable of doing the work are two different things. Sil never asked me directly at first. Instead, she started making comments. At family dinners, she would mention how real family shows up. She'd talk about cousins from her side who helped constantly with her nephew. She'd comment on my schedule, my quiet life, my lack of kids. Little observations, little reminders. Piece by piece, she was building an argument. Not for something small, for something much bigger. And about 8 months later, that argument finally turned into a request. The request came wrapped in an assumption. Mark called a week before my birthday to confirm dinner plans. The KBBQ place I had picked, what time people were arriving, who was bringing what. It sounded like any normal planning call we'd had a dozen times before. Then, near the end of the conversation, he mentioned he was planning to bring Connor. Not asking, planning. The way someone mentions something that's already decided. I told him Connor shouldn't come. KBBQ restaurants are loud by design, open grills running constantly, industrial ventilation fans overhead, metal surfaces reflecting every sound in the room. Tables packed close together, timers beeping, people talking over the noise, smoke, heat, strong smells. For most people, it's just chaotic. For Connor, it's the definition of overstimulated. And beyond the general logic, we already had proof. 2 years earlier, the whole family had gone to a KBBQ restaurant together. Connor had been doing well that week, and Mark thought it would be fine. For about 20 minutes, it actually seemed like it might be. Then a table next to us got loud. A timer went off. Someone dropped a metal tray. Connor went into a full meltdown before anyone had taken a second bite. The entire evening collapsed immediately. Mark took Connor outside and spent over an hour trying to calm him down in the parking lot. My parents, feeling guilty about sitting inside while Mark struggled outside, packed up their food and followed him. I stayed at the table alone, surrounded by untouched plates. Eventually, I paid the bill for a dinner nobody ate. I wasn't interested in repeating that scene at my own birthday. So I explained all of this to Mark, calmly, step by step. I reminded him exactly what had happened last time, in that exact kind of restaurant. I told him the environment wasn't right for Connor and that forcing him into it again would be setting him up to fail. And I said something else too. I said this was one of the boundaries I had already been clear about. Mark went quiet. Then he said I was punishing Connor for being autistic. I told him I wasn't punishing Connor. I was protecting him from a situation that had already proven itself harmful, and protecting my birthday from turning into a crisis I hadn't agreed to manage. He said those were the same thing. I said they weren't, and that he was still welcome to come alone. He said he'd think about it. He didn't show up to the dinner, and when I got home that night, I honestly thought the disagreement had ended there. It hadn't. It was just the moment the argument finally stopped being quiet. About 3 weeks after the birthday dinner, Mark called again. He opened with context, the way he always did when he needed something significant. He and Sil had been planning a trip to Europe, 10 days, flights already priced out, hotels already shortlisted. He described it as their second honeymoon, a chance to reconnect after a difficult year. Then he got to the actual point. He wanted me to move into his house for the full 10 days and care for Connor while they were away. I let him finish before I answered. 10 days, alone, 90 minutes from my own apartment, responsible for a teenager I had already proven I couldn't safely support through a crisis. My cat either locked alone in my apartment or boarded somewhere at my expense. And no one nearby who actually knew Connor's routines. Just me. In a situation I had already failed once, scaled up by a factor of 40. I told him no. Then, because I had learned vague refusals only invite arguments, I explained the reasons one by one. The distance. 90 minutes each way meant that even in a non-emergency situation, I was already operating at a disadvantage. The allergy. Connor couldn't stay at my apartment because of the cat, and staying at Mark's house for 10 days meant boarding my cat, a logistical problem and expense that existed only because of a trip I hadn't planned. The experience gap. I had tried 6 hours. 6 hours ended badly. Mark was asking for 240. The safety issue. If Connor had a severe meltdown at 2 in the morning on day 6, I would not be the person who could reach him. Connor deserved someone who actually knew how to help him. Pretending otherwise would not be kindness, it would be negligence. And finally, I reminded Mark of something he had already agreed to 2 years earlier. These were the boundaries we had set. Mark listened to everything. Then he said he understood my concerns, but this trip meant a lot to him and Sil. He said he could pay me. He even put a number on it. I told him the amount didn't matter, money didn't change what I was capable of, and it didn't change what Connor needed. My answer was still no. He said he would look into other options. His voice had shifted, not angry, but recalculating. 2 days later, the recalculation appeared in the family group chat. I never saw exactly how Mark explained the situation to everyone beforehand, but the message itself was carefully worded. Neutral language that framed the problem as a shared family challenge. Relatives responded quickly. Cousins asked how they could help. The tone was sympathetic and slowly drifting in a direction I recognized. Pressure building without a visible source. Then my parents replied. My mother posted first, clearly and directly. This was not an emergency. Mark and Sil were planning an optional vacation. Essel could stay home with Connor if necessary. No one in the family would be pressured into providing care they were not equipped to give. My father followed with a single sentence that added nothing, and didn't need to. The chat went quiet. Not resolved, not agreed on, just stalled. Sil didn't respond to my parents. Not a word, no argument, no attempt to reframe the situation. She simply went silent. And I realized later that the silence wasn't acceptance. It was strategy. She had just decided the group chat wasn't the room where this argument would be won. After the group chat went quiet, I had time to think. What kept coming back to me wasn't just the 10-day Europe request, it was the pattern underneath it. The vacation was simply the largest version of something that had been building for over a year, a steady accumulation of smaller requests, smaller expectations, smaller moments where the assumption was that eventually I would stop saying no. 6 months before the birthday dinner, there had been a Saturday pickup request. Mark had a work conflict, Sil had an appointment, and they asked if I could collect Connor from a program he attended and stay with him until Mark got home. I said no. Not dramatically, just clearly. I had plans, and more importantly, I had already established the boundary that I wasn't a safe solo caregiver for Connor. Nothing about that situation had changed. The response wasn't an argument, it was silence. Then, at the next family dinner, a comment floated across the table about how some people in the family carried more weight than others. Nobody said my name. Nobody needed to. A few months later, there was a last-minute overnight request that I declined for the same reasons. That refusal produced the same pattern: polite acceptance in the moment, followed by a noticeable shift in the atmosphere at family gatherings afterward. Cooler conversations, longer pauses, a sense that I had quietly failed some test nobody had explained in advance. There was also a holiday dinner, I don't remember which one, where Sil spent a large part of the evening talking about how things worked in her family growing up. Her cousins helped constantly, aunts handled pickups without being asked. People didn't wait for permission to step in. She never said I should do the same. She simply talked about it often enough that the comparison became obvious. Piece by piece, the message was being constructed. My boundaries were preferences. My reasons were excuses. And every time I said no, I was proving something about my character. For a long time, I tolerated that argument quietly. After the group chat, I stopped trying to defend myself against it and started paying attention to what was actually being asked, and whether the request made sense. About a month later, my Uncle Jeff called with a straightforward favor. He and his wife had a wedding out of state and needed someone to stay with their daughter Stacy for the weekend. Stacy is 16. She is, in every meaningful way, a typical teenager. She doesn't require specialized care. She doesn't have medical triggers or sensory thresholds that can collapse an evening without warning. She just needed a responsible adult in the house. Food, transportation, basic supervision. I said yes immediately. The weekend was easy. On Saturday, I took Stacy to Disneyland. Her idea, my job was simply to drive and buy the tickets. We spent 8 hours walking around the park, standing in lines, eating overpriced food, and riding whatever attractions she wanted to try. She knew exactly what she wanted to do. I mostly just followed along. It was honestly a very normal weekend with a teenager. Sunday morning, she slept until noon. I made eggs. We watched something on television. Jeff picked her up Sunday evening. The entire arrangement was exactly as uncomplicated as it sounds. No meltdowns, no crises, no situations where someone needed specialized training to help. Just a teenager and the quiet weekend. I didn't post about it anywhere. I didn't mention it in the family group chat. At some point the following week, I casually told my sister about the Disneyland trip the way you mention any ordinary weekend plan. I didn't think it required an explanation. I didn't think it required permission. And I definitely didn't think it would become the piece of information that blew the entire situation open. Before I get to the kitchen, the moment where this finally exploded, I want to be clear about something. The boundaries I had set were not improvised. They had been stated clearly, discussed openly, and agreed to by everyone involved long before Sael ever joined the family. There were 4 of them. The first was the most important. I am not a safe solo caregiver for Connor during a meltdown. That wasn't speculation. 2 years earlier, I had tried watching Connor alone for an afternoon. The attempt lasted 6 hours and ended with Connor in genuine distress and me standing there with no idea how to help him. Afterward, I told Mark directly. My parents were present, my sister was there, everyone agreed that knowing your limits and stating them honestly was responsible. Those were the boundaries. The second boundary was practical. My cat. Connor's allergy is severe enough that bringing him to my apartment has never been realistic. If I stayed at Mark's house for 10 days, my cat would need to be boarded, at my expense, to solve a logistical problem created by a vacation I hadn't planned. The third boundary was distance. 90 minutes between my apartment and Mark's house sounds manageable until you imagine a meltdown at 2 in the morning. At that point, 90 minutes isn't a commute. It's the difference between help arriving quickly and help still being on the freeway while the situation escalates. The fourth boundary tied the other three together. I was simply not the right person for that role. Acknowledging that wasn't a rejection of Connor, it was an honest assessment of what Connor needed versus what I could actually provide. Connor requires caregivers with years of practiced experience responding to his triggers. I am not one of those people. Putting me in charge of 10 days of solo care wouldn't have been generosity. It would have been risk. Sil knew all of this. Mark had explained it before they married. She said she understood and respected the boundaries. That understanding lasted about 8 months. Then the comments started. Now the KBBQ accusation that I was punishing Connor for being autistic. That claim was repeated often, and it was also wrong. Punishment is a consequence delivered because someone did something wrong. Connor did nothing wrong. What I did was recognize a pattern we had already seen. 2 years earlier, in that exact type of restaurant, Connor had gone into a meltdown before the food arrived. Mark spent the evening trying to calm him down in the parking lot. My parents followed him outside. I sat alone at the table and eventually paid for a dinner nobody ate. That wasn't theory, that was evidence. Keeping Connor out of that environment wasn't punishment. It was applying what we already knew. Now the Stacy comparison, because this was the center of Sil's argument. Her position was simple. If I could take Stacy for a weekend, I was choosing not to take Connor. Here is the real comparison. Connor is 16, nonverbal, and requires caregivers with specific experience responding to his triggers. He is severely allergic to my cat. His house is 90 minutes from mine. The request was 10 days of solo care. I had tried 6 hours once and failed. Stacy is 16, neurotypical, and fully capable of managing herself. She needed an adult present for one weekend. No specialized knowledge, no medical concerns, one Disneyland trip and a quiet Sunday. The difference between those two situations is not love. But love was the argument Sil kept returning to. The idea that if I truly cared about Connor, I would simply do it. Loving someone and being the right person to care for them in a crisis are not the same thing. A surgeon who loves a family member does not perform their own relative's operation. The love is real. The judgment about who should be in the room is also real. I understood that about Connor. Mark had accepted it once. Sil had decided she didn't. And the moment she heard about Disneyland, she decided the argument needed to move somewhere more public, which is how we ended up in that kitchen. The birthday dinner happened without incident. That sentence sounds ordinary. In reality, it was the clearest piece of evidence in the entire situation. The restaurant was exactly what KBBQ restaurants always are. Loud grills at every table, ventilation fans overhead, timers going off, people talking over the noise. My parents were there, my sister was there. We ordered too much food, ate most of it, and stayed at the table for 2 hours. No one had to leave. No one followed anyone outside to calm a meltdown. No one sat alone at a table paying for food nobody ate. At 10 o'clock, I drove home with a bag of leftovers and the quiet relief of an evening that had unfolded exactly the way it was supposed to. A birthday dinner that ended when I decided to leave, not when a crisis forced everyone out. Mark hadn't come, and I expected that the moment he said he'd think about it. What I didn't expect was how clearly the evening proved the point I had been making for months. The night had worked because I had held the boundary. That wasn't coincidence. It was cause and effect. My phone rang at 10:15. Mark had been crying, or had recently been. I could hear it in the first few sentences, the flatness people get when they've been emotional and are trying to sound controlled. He said the dinner had been hard for him to think about. He said it felt like I had chosen to celebrate without my family. Then he brought up Connor. He said Connor had noticed the absence. I wasn't sure I believed that, but I let him talk. Then the conversation shifted. He said Sil had something she wanted to say to me directly. He explained that she had been processing the situation for a while, and that hearing about the Disneyland trip had made things worse. He didn't say who told her, I didn't ask. He also said something else. She isn't angry. He said it twice in about 30 seconds. which told me very clearly that she was. I told him I would hear her out. One conversation, in person, at their house. If she had something she needed to say, I would sit across from her and listen to all of it before I responded. Mark agreed immediately. The relief in his voice was obvious. The kind you hear when someone has been holding a difficult conversation and just successfully handed it to someone else. I set the phone down and stood in my kitchen for a moment with the takeout bag still on the counter. The following Sunday, I drove the 90 minutes to Mark's house. I didn't bring notes. I didn't bring a prepared argument. I didn't need one. My position hadn't changed. The boundaries were the same ones I had already explained months earlier. And one of them was simple. Connor wasn't my child. I already knew what the meeting was about. Stacy, Disneyland. The comparison SIL had been quietly building ever since she went silent in the group chat. The idea that saying yes to one teenager and no to another revealed something deliberate about how I valued the people in my family. I decided not to bring it up first. I wasn't going to walk in defending myself before she had even spoken. If she had an argument to make, I wanted to hear the entire thing. Every piece of it. I knocked on the door already knowing what waited on the other side. I just needed them to say it out loud before I answered. Sil was standing when I walked in. Mark was at the kitchen table, seated with the careful posture of someone who had already decided this was not going to be his conversation to run. He looked like a man who had arranged something and was now waiting to see how it went. Sil was near the counter, arms at her sides, and she had the particular stillness of a person who had been rehearsing. Not nervous, but ready. I sat down at the table without being invited. She didn't build toward it. No preamble, no temperature check, no attempt to establish that this was a reasonable conversation between reasonable people. You took Stacy to Disneyland, she said. You spent an entire weekend with Jeff's daughter. You bought her tickets. You drove her there. You gave her a whole day at a theme park and brought her home safe on Sunday night. She paused. And you can't give Connor one weekend. You couldn't manage 10 days for his father. You have never once stepped up for this family when it actually required something from you. I sat with my hands on the table and let her continue. She said I was choosing convenience over family. She said every time I declined a request, I was making a calculation, not a genuine assessment of my capacity, but a choice about what I was willing to prioritize. She said I treated Connor's needs as an inconvenience rather than as the reality of who he was. Then she got to the village. She said the village wasn't something you applied selectively. Everyone showed up, not when it was convenient, not when the child was easy. You showed up because the child needed you and you were family. The people she grew up around didn't make lists of what they would or wouldn't do. They just appeared. She said I was a terrible uncle. Then she looked at me directly and said, "So, honestly, good thing you don't have kids." The kitchen went quiet. Mark was still looking at the table. I glanced at him once and he didn't look up. I waited a few seconds. "Are you finished?" I asked. She said she was. I told her I had heard everything she said and I was going to respond to the argument itself. I started with the comparison. Connor is 16, nonverbal, and requires continuous care from people who have spent years learning how to reach him during a crisis. When he goes into a meltdown, the list of people who can help him is specific and short, built through years of relationship and practice, not willingness alone. He is severely allergic to my cat. His house is 90 minutes from mine. The request was 10 days of solo care with no backup within reasonable distance. I had attempted 6 hours once and had been unable to help him when it mattered. Stacy is 16, neurotypical, and self-sufficient in every practical sense. She needed an adult present in the house for one weekend. No specialized knowledge, no medical considerations, no cat allergy, no significant distance. She had a specific idea of what she wanted to do on Saturday, Disneyland, and needed transportation and someone to walk around a theme park with. Those were not the same situation. The difference between saying yes to Stacy and no to Connor was not about how much I valued either of them. It was an honest accounting of what each situation required and whether I was capable of providing it. One of them I was. One of them I was not. Pretending otherwise would not have been love. It would have been negligence toward a child who deserved better than a caregiver who was out of their depth. Then I said the thing I had come specifically to say. Sil had agreed before she married Mark to respect the boundaries that had been established for Connor's care. Mark had explained them to her. She had indicated she understood them. The commitment that had been broken in this situation was not mine, it was hers. I had been consistent for 2 years. I looked at Mark when I finished. He had been quiet through everything I said. Now he was crying, not dramatically, just the quiet, exhausted tears of someone who had been holding a weight for a long time. He said he was sorry. He said he just needed help. Then he said he would pay me. He named a number higher than the first one he had offered. I told him this was not about money. He nodded quickly, like someone who had hoped anyway. For a moment, nobody spoke. Mark wiped his face and looked up at me for the first time. "I don't know what else to do," he said quietly. "Connor is getting bigger. When he melts down, it takes both of us sometimes. And if something happens and I'm not there..." He stopped. Then he said he would move. He would find an apartment closer to mine. He would uproot their household, pull Connor from his routines and support network, relocate the entire family. If it meant I would agree to be part of Connor's care arrangement. I looked at him for a long moment. "Mark," I said, "moving wouldn't change the cat allergy." The room went quiet. Sil had no response. Mark had no response. Because there was no response. It was a concrete medical fact, the kind that does not bend to ideology or emotion. Moving cities would not cure Connor's allergy. It would not give me the skills I didn't have. It would not change the list of people who could reach Connor in a crisis. The argument was over. Not because anyone had won, because there was nothing left to say. I stood up, picked up my keys, and left. I drove 90 minutes home and started making calls the following morning. The first was to my building's management office. I asked about transferring to a different unit within the same property system, a different complex, different area of the city, same lease terms. They said it was possible. I said I'd like to move forward as soon as something became available. It took 3 weeks. I gave my new address to my parents and my sister. I did not give it to Mark. The second call was to my phone carrier. I changed my number that same week. My parents got the new one. My sister got it. Mark's household did not. I told my parents what had happened at the kitchen table. All of it, including what Sil had said at the end. They were quiet for a moment. Then my mother said she was disappointed, specifically because Sil had made a promise before the wedding and had spent over a year working against it. My father said less, which with him usually means more. My sister said she wasn't surprised. She said she had been watching the pattern build for months. Mark called my old number twice the week after I moved. I know because my carrier notified me. I didn't retrieve the voicemails. I saved the call log the way I save anything that might matter later. Out of habit, not expectation. I've been researching work opportunities overseas for the past several months. I have a realistic timeline. I'm not running from anything. I'm building towards something which is a different thing entirely, even if it looks the same from the outside. There are people who will read this and say I was too rigid, that family requires flexibility, that Connor deserved more from me than a consistent no. Here is what I'd say to that. I gave Connor what I actually had to give: presence at the events I could attend safely, honesty about what I couldn't provide, and the integrity not to place him in the care of someone unqualified just to make his father's life more convenient. The village Sil wanted is a real thing. It works when it's built on genuine capacity and genuine choice. It doesn't work when it's conscripted, when the people inside it are there because they were guilted or pressured or worn down until they stopped saying no. A village built on resentment isn't support. It's just a different kind of crisis waiting to happen. Connor is not my child. That was never a rejection of him. It was the most honest thing I could offer. They wanted a village. Villages are built by people who choose to be there. I made my choice. It just wasn't the one they wanted. A few weeks after I moved, I drove past the old neighborhood once on my way to meet a friend for dinner. Not intentionally, just a route I used to take out of habit. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. The house where Mark lives was still there, lights on in the kitchen window, the same way it always had been. I kept driving. Some problems are meant to be solved. Others are just meant to be left behind. If any part of this felt familiar, if you've ever been the one who stayed quiet and stayed useful and told yourself it was fine, drop it in the comments. And if you're somewhere in the middle of figuring out your own floor, I hope this helped.